Why did Jesus keep disappearing to pray? Why pray all night before major decisions? Why does Gethsemane feel like the center of the story? Most people remember the miracles, the crowds, the confrontations, the cross. Fewer notice the hidden rhythm underneath it all, the moments when Jesus steps away from noise, from urgency, from people demanding answers, and chooses silence with the Father. In the Gospels, prayer is not background atmosphere. It is often the place where mission is clarified, pressure is absorbed, and obedience is chosen before anyone else sees it. But here's the thing. If we skip Jesus' prayer life, we may misunderstand Jesus' public life. The healings, the teaching, the authority, even the courage to walk towards suffering, all appear connected to what happened in secret first. Not as spectacle, not as performance, but as communion. Our thesis is simple. Jesus' prayer life is the hidden framework of his ministry where identity, direction, and surrender are formed before action. And our path is clear. We will trace the silence of desert solitude before ministry, the weight of all-night prayer on mountains, the breaking point of Gethsemane's agony and surrender, and the hidden pattern that seems to stand behind his miracles. In the desert, after baptism, Jesus enters isolation before public power. The gospel accounts emphasize testing, hunger, and spiritual conflict, but they also imply focused dependence, a stripping away of distraction so calling can be faced without illusion. Before the crowds call him teacher, prophet, or threat, he stands alone before God. That sequence matters. Then come the mountain nights, when he withdraws for extended prayer, including before pivotal choices like the calling of the 12. We should be careful not to overstate timelines where details differ between accounts, but the repeated pattern is hard to ignore. Critical transitions are often preceded by prayer, as if public decisions are being carried through private wrestling first. And then Gethsemane, where prayer is no longer quiet discipline alone, but visible agony. Here we hear the tension in full, the human desire to avoid the cup, and the surrendered will that embraces the Father's purpose. This is not theatrical language, it is the language of cost. If we want to understand Christian obedience, we cannot look only at the cross. We must also listen in the garden, where surrender was spoken before suffering was endured. Here's what most people miss. Prayer in the life of Jesus is not an escape from mission. It is the furnace of mission. The miracles may look sudden to the crowd, but the Gospels often frame them within a deeper interior life of dependence, compassion, and timing. Even where direct causal links are not explicitly stated in every episode, the narrative texture suggests continuity between communion and power. So this is not just a study of ancient habits, it is an invitation to recover sequence, presence before action, listening before strategy, surrender before impact. If the Son chose this hidden path, perhaps the Church was never meant to run on urgency alone. And maybe that is the unsettling question for us tonight. If Jesus needed the secret place, what makes us think we can live without it? What if the most public life in the Gospels was built in private? What if the key to understanding Jesus is not only what he said in crowds, but where he went when the crowds were gone? If we watch carefully, a pattern appears. He steps away, he prays, and then he acts. He withdraws, he wrestles, and then he speaks with clarity. Is that a side detail, or is it the engine? The question before us is unsettling because it sounds practical, not dramatic. Are we misreading his ministry by treating prayer as atmosphere instead of foundation? In many modern readings, we rush to outcomes. We track miracles, conflicts, and turning points. We measure impact by what can be seen. But in the gospel rhythm, visible action often follows invisible communion. Public authority seems to rise from hidden surrender. If that sequence is true, then skipping prayer does not just reduce devotion. It distorts interpretation. This is why we begin before the crowds, before the momentum, before the reputation hardens. We begin in the desert. After Jesus' baptism, the Synoptic Gospels place him in the wilderness for 40 days, led by the Spirit, facing testing, hunger, and confrontation with the tempter. The references are familiar: Matthew 4, Mark 1, Luke 4, though details and order vary across accounts in ways scholars continue to map. Yet the broad frame is stable. Before launching public ministry, he enters isolation. Why start there? Why not begin with a sermon in Jerusalem, a sign in the temple courts, a direct claim of kingship? Instead, we are given solitude, deprivation, and prayerful dependence. The desert is not merely geography. It is theological space. Israel had a wilderness memory. Moses had a wilderness memory. Elijah had a wilderness memory. In biblical imagination, wilderness can be the place where identity is stripped down to obedience and trust. Is Jesus replaying Israel's story faithfully where Israel failed? Many interpreters say yes, with caution about exact literary intent in each author. Notice what this scene refuses. It refuses haste. It refuses self-display. It refuses the shortcut from calling to spectacle. The temptations themselves, especially in Matthew and Luke, can be read as counterfeit paths to mission: bread without trust, power without suffering, signs without submission. Even if we avoid overconfident harmonization, the narrative pressure is clear. The one who will feed crowds first rejects using power for self-preservation. The one who will receive all authority refuses authority detached from worship. The one who will be recognized publicly declines to force recognition on demand. What is happening in prayer here? The text does not always narrate the interior in full detail, and we should not pretend to hear every thought, but the shape suggests communion under pressure, dependence in hunger, alignment under temptation, identity tested before mission deployed. In modern terms, we might call it formation before function. In biblical terms, it is obedience before manifestation. And this matters for our central dilemma. If Jesus' ministry is interpreted only through visible outcomes, then the desert becomes prelude music. But if his hidden prayer life is framework, the desert becomes structural. It is where public integrity is forged. It is where the ministry is protected from becoming a performance. Think of the contrast. In one reading, ministry begins when people notice. In another reading, ministry begins when obedience is chosen in secret. Which reading changes how we understand power? Which reading better explains why Jesus repeatedly disappears even when demand is rising? There is also a timing lesson here that should not be flattened into technique. Jesus does not emerge from the wilderness with a brand strategy. He emerges with scriptural clarity and a tested posture of trust. The famous responses to temptation, drawn from Deuteronomy, are not random verses used like charms. They reveal a mind saturated in Scripture and a will anchored in the Father's Word. Can we prove every internal motive line by line? No. But can we responsibly say that hidden devotion and scriptural obedience are intertwined here? Yes, that is a cautious and text-aware conclusion. Some traditions also connect this wilderness movement with echoes of Qumran ascetic patterns, broader Second Temple fasting practices, and prophetic withdrawal motifs. Those links can illuminate context, but they should remain suggestive, not definitive. The point does not depend on speculative reconstruction. The point is already in the canonical story. The public ministry is birthed through hidden dependence. So here is the first anchor for our thesis. Desert solitude is not a detour around ministry. It is the first laboratory of ministry. Communion before power, listening before proclamation, surrender before visibility. And now ask a harder question. If this is where Jesus starts, what does it expose in us? Do we seek platform before formation? Do we want authority without hidden obedience? We may admire his miracles while quietly bypassing his method. A brief pastoral word and only this: the secret place is not punishment for people who failed publicly. It is preparation for people who must endure publicly. If even Jesus did not skip this, we should not treat it as optional. But the desert is only the beginning. The pattern does not disappear once ministry gains momentum. It repeats, and it repeats in the night. When we move into the gospel narratives of active ministry, we repeatedly meet an odd movement. Crowds gather, needs multiply, conflict rises, and Jesus withdraws to pray. Luke especially emphasizes this rhythm, noting that he often withdrew to lonely places and prayed, while his fame spread and requests increased. Luke 5:15-16. That juxtaposition is striking. Demand goes up. Withdrawal deepens. In modern logic, that feels backward. At key decision points, the pattern becomes even more explicit. In Luke 6, before selecting the 12, Jesus spends the night in prayer to God, then chooses them at daybreak. The 12 are not a minor staffing choice. They become symbolic of renewed Israel, tied to 12 tribes, imagery, and multiple traditions, and central to the future witness movement. Before that choice, there is all-night prayer. Why does this matter? Because it challenges a common assumption that spiritual authority is mostly spontaneous charisma. The Gospels do portray authority in Jesus' words and actions, yes. But around decisive transitions, they also portray sustained communion. Night prayer is not ornamental piety. It appears as discernment under weight, and the mountain setting adds texture. Mountains in biblical literature can signal encounter, revelation, and boundary moments, though we should avoid turning every hill into a coded symbol. Still, scenes like prayer before the Transfiguration references, or prayer around moments of teaching and commissioning, create a narrative landscape where elevation and solitude reinforce concentration. Away from noise, vision clarifies. Here is the contrast line we cannot ignore. The crowds usually read urgency as a command. Act now, answer now, fix now. Jesus often reads urgency as a reason to withdraw first. Is that avoidance, or is that leadership under God rather than under pressure? Consider also what night prayer implies physically. Fatigue is real. Ministry days in the text are often full. To pray through the night is costly. It is not a decorative routine added when convenient. It suggests that some choices cannot be carried by instinct alone. They must be carried in prayer until dawn. Could there be historical compression in how each evangelist arranges episodes? Yes, most scholars acknowledge theological shaping in narrative arrangement, but even with compositional freedom, recurring motifs are meaningful. Gospel writers are not accidentally repeating prayer before major moments. They are teaching readers how to see. The 12 scene presses this further. Jesus does not choose from distance like a strategist reading profiles. He chooses after vigil, public team, private wrestling, public mission, private surrender. If we claim to follow his mission pattern while ignoring that sequence, what exactly are we following? We can push into another layer. Prayer in these mountain night moments is not only about decisions, it also appears linked to identity and relationship. In multiple passages, Jesus addresses God as Father with intimacy and trust, while also yielding to the Father's will under tension. That relational axis keeps power from becoming self-referential. Authority remains filial, not autonomous. This helps explain why prayer does not vanish when miracles increase. If prayer were merely a tool to secure outcomes, successful outcomes would reduce prayer. But in Jesus, success does not reduce prayer. It seems to intensify the need for it. Why? Because prayer is not only instrumental, it is relational and obedient. It is how mission stays anchored to the sender. There are traditions that speculate on exact durations, specific mountain identifications, and harmonized chronologies across all withdrawals. We should be careful. Not every withdrawal is dated. Not every location is secure. Not every timeline can be tightened without forcing the texts. Yet uncertainty on detail does not erase clarity on pattern, and the pattern contributes directly to our central thesis. If identity, direction, and obedience are formed before action, then all-night prayer is not excess. It is alignment work. It is where public choices are purified from the seduction of speed. Ask yourself one more contrast. Are we trying to imitate Jesus' visible compassion while operating from invisible exhaustion? Are we demanding fruit from ministries that have no night watch with God? The question is uncomfortable because it names a modern wound. We are often over-informed, over-connected, and under-prayed. Another brief pastoral reflection. Prayer does not make us passive. In Jesus, prayer precedes costly movement into people's pain. The one who prays through the night still walks into crowds by morning. Communion is not retreat from responsibility. It is preparation for responsibility. Yet even these mountain vigils are not the deepest revelation of the pattern. For that, we must enter the garden, where prayer is no longer quiet strength alone, but visible agony. Gethsemane stands near the center of the Passion narratives in Matthew 26, Mark 14, and Luke 22, with John offering complementary angles around Jesus' final hours. Here, the vocabulary shifts. We are no longer mostly watching strategic withdrawal before decisions. We are watching sorrow, distress, and surrender under imminent suffering. Jesus asks close disciples to remain awake and watch. He withdraws a short distance to pray. He returns and finds them sleeping. The cycle repeats. The details vary across accounts, including specific wording and emphases, and Luke includes references such as sweat like drops of blood, interpreted differently in translation and manuscript discussions. But the core remains unmistakable. In the shadow of arrest, Jesus prays through agony. This is where simplistic spirituality fails. Prayer here is not serene mood management. It is conflict in communion. If possible, let this cup pass, yet not my will, but yours. 2 lines, 1 tension. Human aversion to suffering and surrendered obedience to the Father meet in the same breath. What does this reveal about our central question? It reveals that hidden prayer is not merely how Jesus prepares for productive ministry. It is how he carries unbearable obedience. The garden exposes prayer as the place where costly faithfulness becomes possible before the public event unfolds. Notice the order again. The cross is public. Surrender is spoken first in private. The world sees execution. The Father hears consent in the night. If we preach the cross without the garden, we risk presenting obedience as sudden heroism rather than prayer-shaped fidelity. There is also a communal warning in the sleeping disciples. While Jesus wrestles, they collapse into drowsiness and confusion. We should avoid mocking them. They are human under fear. But the scene draws a sharp contrast between watchfulness and drift. Spirit willing, flesh weak, as one account phrases it. Is this only their failure, or is it our mirror? Some interpreters debate whether the cup language points primarily to wrath motifs, covenant suffering, prophetic vocation fulfillment, or a layered convergence of these themes. The exact theological mapping can differ by tradition. Still, no tradition seriously denies that Gethsemane reveals a decisive act of surrendered will in prayer. And this act is not detached from earlier patterns. Desert formation, mountain discernment, garden surrender. The line is continuous. Communion before power, listening before direction, surrender before impact. What changes in Gethsemane is the intensity. The same hidden framework now bears maximum weight. This should reframe how we read courage in Jesus. Courage is not emotional numbness. It is obedience carried through fear. Prayer does not erase dread. It orders dread under trust. That is a more durable model than triumphant slogans. Can we prove every psychological nuance with precision? No, and we should not pretend otherwise. The Gospels are theological narratives, not modern clinical reports. But they are concrete enough to show sequence and intention. Jesus does not stumble accidentally into sacrificial mission. He receives and yields through prayer. Here is a question that may disturb us. If the decisive yes in Jesus' path is spoken in hidden anguish, what does that imply for discipleship that avoids hidden anguish altogether? Have we reduced faithfulness to public branding while neglecting the interior surrender that sustains it? A small pastoral line, because this moment deserves reverence. If your prayers feel weak because they include tears, hesitation, or trembling, Gethsemane says trembling can still be faithful. Surrender is not the absence of struggle. Sometimes surrender is struggle offered to God. And now we turn to the final movement, where many viewers feel tension. Can we responsibly connect this hidden prayer life to the visible miracles without making exaggerated claims? When people read miracle stories, attention naturally goes to the event, the healed body, the calm sea, the fed multitude, the restored outcast, the astonished crowd. These moments matter profoundly. Yet if we read the wider narrative flow, we notice that Jesus' actions are often framed by withdrawal, prayer, compassion language, and reference to the Father's will and timing. Does every miracle scene include a direct sentence saying, "This happened because of a prior prayer vigil"? No, we should avoid inventing direct causal lines where the text is silent. That is exactly where belongs if someone claims too much. But neither should we ignore the pattern embedded across episodes. Narrative theology often works by repeated texture, not only explicit formulas. For example, in John's Gospel, Jesus repeatedly speaks of doing what he sees the Father doing, seeking the will of the one who sent him, and acting in appointed hour language. Synoptic narratives emphasize compassion, authority, and spirit empowerment with their own vocabulary. Different emphases, same broad orientation. Jesus' public works are not independent projects. They are relationally sourced. Even in scenes where a quick reading sees only spontaneity, a slower reading detects alignment. He withdraws after major public moments. He refuses certain expectations from crowds. He times movements in ways that frustrate pressure. He can say no to demands that appear urgent. Why? Because mission is not crowd-governed, it is Father-governed. This is where the hidden pattern behind miracles becomes less about mechanics and more about posture. Prayer is not a technique to trigger power. Prayer is communion that keeps power obedient, compassionate, and timed. Without that frame, miracles can be misread as spectacle. With that frame, miracles become signs within covenant purpose. There are historical and theological debates about miracle genre, eyewitness memory, redaction shaping, and ancient biography conventions. Those debates matter in academic settings, but even across interpretive schools, one cautious observation can stand. The Gospels present Jesus' active ministry as deeply integrated with his life of prayerful dependence. Another contrast line may help. In celebrity culture, visibility creates identity. In Jesus' pattern, identity sustains visibility. In performance culture, outcomes justify methods. In Jesus' pattern, methods reveal allegiance before outcomes appear. Could we overstate this and pretend prayer removes all mystery? Yes, and we should not. Prayer does not become an explanatory machine that answers every question about suffering, delay, or unanswered requests. The point is more restrained and more profound. In Jesus, prayer is where mission is held together when circumstances strain it. Think of the progression we have traced. In the desert, prayer steadies identity under temptation. On the mountain nights, prayer clarifies discernment under leadership weight. In Gethsemane, prayer carries surrender under terror. In miracle-laden ministry, prayer preserves alignment under public demand. Different pressures, one hidden framework. If this framework is real, then our central dilemma sharpens. Are we reading Jesus as a miracle worker who happened to pray, or as the praying Son whose works flow from communion with the Father? The difference is not semantic. It changes discipleship, leadership, and expectation. For discipleship, it means holiness is not mainly image management. It is unseen fidelity. For leadership, it means decisions should be born in prayer, not merely justified afterward. For communities, it means urgency cannot permanently outrun listening. For mission, it means fruit detached from communion may impress for a season, but rarely endures with integrity. And here we should handle pastoral urgency without turning preachy. The church in many places is exhausted. Individuals are exhausted. Constant stimulation trains us to react faster, not to discern deeper. We scroll, we answer, we perform, and we call it faithfulness. But is speed the same as obedience? Is output the same as surrender? If Jesus repeatedly moved from hidden communion to public action, then perhaps the crisis is not that we lack opportunities. Perhaps the crisis is that we have reversed the order. One more caution for honesty. We must not weaponize this pattern against wounded people, as if anyone who struggles spiritually simply failed at private prayer. Human suffering includes trauma, illness, injustice, and factors that cannot be reduced to devotional effort. Jesus shows compassion, not harsh simplification. Yet compassion does not cancel sequence. Presence still comes before power. And what about those moments when we do pray and still feel unanswered? The Gethsemane pattern helps here too. The cup was not removed, yet prayer was not pointless. Prayer shaped obedience in the very path that remained hard. That is not a cheap answer. It is a costly one. So where does this leave our thesis? It leaves it stronger, not weaker. Jesus' prayer life is not a devotional footnote. It is the hidden architecture of his ministry. Desert solitude, mountain vigils, and garden surrender reveal a repeated sequence that interprets the works, not merely accompanies them. And where does it leave our main question? It leaves it pressing against us personally. If the Gospels show Jesus withdrawing into hidden prayer before decisive moments, are we misreading him by treating prayer as background? The evidence suggests yes. At minimum, we are reading selectively. At worst, we are imitating his outcomes while rejecting his path. Maybe this is why the pattern feels mysterious even now. It cannot be fully borrowed as a formula. It can only be entered as a relationship. The secret place is not a productivity hack. It is where self-importance is reduced, desires are reordered, and mission is received rather than invented. Here is the final pastoral thread for this section. You do not need dramatic language to begin. Begin with honesty. Begin with scripture open and noise lowered. Begin with the prayer Jesus gave and stay long enough for hurry to lose its grip. Small faithfulness in secret may carry more future weight than visible momentum. Still, one tension remains, and it is the one we must carry into what comes next. If hidden prayer is truly the framework of Jesus' ministry, what would have to change in our churches, our leadership habits, and our own daily lives to recover that order without turning it into performance again? Because that is the danger, isn't it? Even the secret place can be turned into a brand, and if that happens, we are back where we started, visible religion without surrendered communion. So as we move forward, keep one question alive. Not whether prayer sounds important, but whether our sequence matches his sequence. Presence before action, listening before strategy, surrender before impact. If we dare to test that order honestly, we may discover something unsettling and hopeful at once. The power we chase in public may only be trusted to hearts that have already bowed in private. And the next scene forces us to ask whether we are willing to pay that hidden cost. So where does all of this leave us? We began with a troubling possibility that we may admire Jesus' public ministry while overlooking the hidden place that shaped it. And by the end of this journey, the pattern feels difficult to deny. In the desert before platform, there is dependence. On the mountain, before major decisions, there is sustained prayer. In Gethsemane, before the cross, there is agonized surrender. And around the signs and wonders, there is repeated withdrawal, as if visible power must remain tethered to invisible communion. If that sequence is real, then the thesis stands. Jesus' prayer life is not a devotional footnote, it is a structural frame. Identity is settled in secret, direction is clarified in secret, and obedience is strengthened in secret before history sees the result. We should still handle details with care. Exact harmonization of every timeline across the Gospels remains debated, and some historical reconstructions about locations, durations, or literary arrangement remain tentative. But cautious reading does not weaken the core claim. It makes it cleaner. 3 takeaways remain. First, communion comes before power. The desert shows that mission is not launched by urgency, charisma, or strategy alone. It is launched through tested trust. Second, discernment comes before momentum. The all-night prayers show that decisive public choices are carried through private wrestling, not rushed through public pressure. Surrender comes before impact. Gethsemane shows that obedience is not staged in front of an audience. It is spoken in the dark before it is seen in the light. And that means our main question is no longer abstract. If the Gospels consistently show Jesus withdrawing to pray before decisive moments, then treating prayer as background is not a neutral habit. It risks misreading the ministry itself. There is a quiet warning here for every generation of believers. We can be active, informed, and visible, yet still become spiritually misaligned if urgency leads and communion follows behind. We can build ministries that look strong and still crack under pressure because they were never rooted in hidden surrender. But there is also hope. The way of Jesus is not inaccessible because it is hidden. Hidden does not mean impossible. It means unperformed. It means not optimized for applause. It means formation where no one claps. Keep this pastoral line simple. Prayer is not an escape from responsibility. In Jesus, prayer is where responsibility is received without self-deception. Prayer is where fear is named, not denied. Prayer is where the will is bent toward trust before the next hard step. If your life feels fragmented, this sequence offers more than inspiration. Presence before action. Listening before strategy, surrender before impact, not as a slogan but as a practiced order. And one last caution. Even this can be imitated outwardly and still become performance. We can talk about the secret place while still curating an image. We can turn hidden disciplines into visible branding. When that happens, the form remains and the fire fades. So perhaps the final test is not whether we can explain Jesus' prayer life, but whether we are willing to reorder our own life by it. If this episode sharpened how you read the Gospels, subscribe and stay for what comes next. Because the next question may be even more unsettling. If Jesus prayed this way as the Son, what does that reveal about spiritual warfare we barely notice until it is already at our door? Based on what we uncovered in today's episode, answer this in the comments. Do you think hidden prayer is optional if even Jesus needed it? And as always, God bless you.